popular culture, as well as the ways in which our exposure to popular culture shapes our perceptions of self and other, right? I often ask my undergraduate students here at IU, how many of you have ever been to the Middle East? Very few. Okay, excellent. This is great. This is great. Now we have a little bit of a selection bias going on here. Let's imagine we're in a seat of 150, 200 first-year IU students who are taking Intro to World Music and Culture or Pop Culture, and I ask them, how many have ever been in the Middle East? I maybe get 1 or 2 out of 150. How many of you ever intend on going to the Middle East? Maybe 1 or 2. How many of you are friends with or know Arabs or Muslims in your daily life? Very, very few. So then the next question is, so everything you know about the Arab world, everything you know about Islam, everything you know about the Middle East in general, where did you learn it? Where did you learn it? Right? And of course we can say, yeah, books, of course, and newspapers, and media, journals, but the kind of hidden, invisible learning that we often do in regards to understanding self and other takes place through popular cultural forms. Now, why might it be that popular cultural forms are so incredibly efficacious in teaching these notions of self and other, even more so than perhaps news media or journalism? Why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose these movies might be actually more effective at carrying forth our cultural understanding, our cultural literacy, than, say, academic work, scholarly work, journalist work? Why do you suppose? Yeah?
We can relate to a story better than like a news event, like as humans.
Sure. We certainly have a different frame of understanding when we approach news media as when we approach popular culture. As is often the case when we engage with sound and music. We are not experiencing those things with an analytical mind or an analytical frame. We are not assessing the truth value of the information that's being imparted to us. The same is true when we watch movies, right? When we go into the cinema, we often turn off the analytical framing devices in our minds. And instead, we are there for entertainment, which both allows us to suspend disbelief, but also makes us very fertile minds for these kinds of caricatures of representation. If most of what we know about the Middle East, and if most of what we know about Muslims and Arabs in general, and I'll get in a minute to kind of parsing those things out, comes from pop culture, what does that say about our commonsensical notions of the Middle East or Arabs or Muslims or general? What does that say about it? Would it be a healthy understanding, a cultural understanding? No, absolutely not. In fact, the dehumanization practices that we see through the poetics of pop culture actually then carry forth in our commonsensical understandings of how we approach a lot of things regarding difference. And you could, of course, make this exact same documentary about the representational practices of African Americans, of Jews, of Asian Americans in general. This is a documentary about difference as much as it is a documentary about Islamophobia. And it's this notion of difference that becomes the key cultural trope that we learn through pop culture, right? Notions of self and other. This film is also might be considered a historical document, right? It came out mid-2000s, 5, 6, 7, that area, after 9/11. But when I teach this to my current students, many of the films aren't part of their normal upbringing because the film's a bit dated, right? And that allows us a historical document of looking at the ways in which Arabs and Muslims have been portrayed in American popular cinema. And what do you notice about those changes, right? This film begins from the very beginning of cinema, American cinema, and goes up into the present. What do you notice about the changes that take place? Yes?
Well, in a sense, changes reflect the Americans' experience with those countries.
Okay.
That is once the Americans started to oil and so on, of course, changed.
That's right.
Lebanon.
And this is a great point. You notice that the ways in which Arab land or the Orient was, of course, depicted in the early 20th century changes quite a bit following World War II, where all of a sudden the Middle East means something different in America than it once did. And then even further after 9/11, we see another kind of dramatic change in all of these elements. And those changes are very much kind of the signature Orientalism discourse. Right? And then it becomes one of political expediency, where the Middle East and the Arab world becomes a mechanic of political expediency and exerting an American political discourse over that area, that part of the world. Right? And then after 9/11, it kind of comes home, where all of a sudden the Islamophobia we find in American pop culture is centered specifically on Arab Americans as being a potential threat. So the distance collapses with each one of these eras, but at each moment, what we notice is that there's a shifting landscape of Islamophobia in popular culture. And as soon as we might become really adept or skilled at identifying and then talking back at one particular kind of representational strategy, all of a sudden there's another one in its place. Right? I mean, we laugh at the early films that are depicted in here. We laugh at the harems and the belly dancing and the shake and everything. We laugh at that. And we laugh at kind of the really grotesque, hyper-masculine and hyper-militarized action films of the 80s. We laugh at those because we are now trained to spot that kind of ludicrousness in film and to laugh at it, right? It becomes, of course, that wasn't the reaction when they first came out. And even after 9/11, you see all of these shows like 24 and Sleeper Cell and Homeland, all of these notions of trying to understand terrorism and the conflation of terror with an Arab or Muslim threat. But even those, we are now starting to be a bit more equipped or skilled at recognizing the underlying problematics with that kind of representation. The thing that I want to point out is our job is to make visible the things that are currently invisible in American popular cinema. And this film doesn't actually, it's not like, okay, if we can figure out these things, oh, we're all done, good job, we can move on. No. Actually, there's an underlying premise here that we need to apply to the way in which we engage with popular culture today. So, if we think about the films and television shows that we are watching, consuming, we may not see these same kinds of representational strategies because the film industry and the entertainment industry has already moved on to new, more effective models in order to carry forth this kind of othering discourse. The way in which we other groups. Now, what might they be? When you were watching this film, did anyone come up with something that you are currently watching that's not in here that you could easily see makes the same kinds of, gestures, othering gestures? Yes, Laura?
The Good Wife, which I watched I think a year and a half ago, I noticed repeated references both to Palestinians, but also the glorification of both the IDF and the state of Israel. And one episode in particular positioned a relationship between a Palestinian young man and an Israeli young man as that I think the Palestinian young man killed the other guy because they were in a romantic relationship. And so repeatedly we see ideas of homophobia that is present in the Middle East, but use that as a way to glorify other cultures,
right.
Kind of like the pinkwashing.
Right.
Very frequently.
Pinkwashing is a great example. I recently have been required through marriage to watch all of the Game of Thrones episodes. I'm not really into that, but okay, sure, no problem. And you can actually see a lot of the same kind of representational strategies taking place in Game of Thrones, where otherness and difference, whether that be racial or otherwise noted difference, becomes a marker of othering, as a process of othering in those same types of things. The word Arab doesn't need to be there. We are using the same representational tropes in dealing with otherness there as we would anywhere else. If you notice, Hollywood and the TV industry has now switched all of a sudden where they're trying to insert Arab characters or Muslim characters into mainstream sitcoms. Right? They're trying to create representation, so-called good representations of Arabs and Muslims in American pop culture. This is as problematic This is as problematic because it furthers the notion of otherness. It's still part of the same othering tactics. To have the happy, friendly Arab character is actually just as bad as to have these angry, violent Arab characters, because they are equally non-textured, equally superficial, and equally perpetuate a very two-dimensional understanding. The documentary ends on a good note, right? It ends with some examples on how we might do better and how we might move forward. And I really want to kind of amplify those films near the end. But did you notice that all of the so-called goodness of those characters represented in the later films were those Arab characters who had adopted or at least accepted a Western or capitalist mentality, or a Western educational mentality, right? That actually doesn't help. To say that a good Arab is one that acts like an American actually reinforces the self-other dichotomy we're trying to overcome in the first place, right? To say that, oh, no, that's a good Arab character because, you know, they speak English, they watch the same movies I do, they dress the same, you know, they understand, they follow the same politics. What you're basically doing is amplifying sameness. And our job is to humanize difference, right? Our job is to humanize and accept difference. Our job is not to see the sameness in others, right? Our job is to accept and to understand the difference of others. And until we start doing that, we're just going to be replacing tired tropes with other equally tired tropes, even if that might be positive or negative. There's a film that I'm currently writing an article about, and next semester we're going to be doing a screening with the main actor. It's called Junction 48. It just came out. It's an Israeli film. It's the first ever Israeli feature film where the entire cast is Palestinian. It was written by Palestinians. The director is Jewish. However, it is the first ever Israeli feature film to be completely a Palestinian cast about Palestinians living in Israel. And the main actor who wrote the screenplay, we're bringing him out here to IU next April. We're going to do a screening and a Q&A. And I hope you all decide it's going to be a great opportunity. I hope you all decide to come. And when I'm interviewing him about this screenplay, he says, look, watch this film. And it takes on honor crimes, right? This is probably the biggest taboo in Arab culture, is this notion of honor crimes and gendered violence in general. And the movie takes on this issue, but it does so in a very nuanced and textured way, where you understand the perspectives of multiple characters on this issue. Everyone's positionality is known. And we also see ways in which this issue of gendered violence becomes a source of collaboration amongst characters. The good guys are Arabs, the bad guys are Arabs. The good guys are also bad guys, and the bad guys are also good guys, right? The entire film is a textured, three-dimensional understanding of what it's like to be Palestinian living in Israel. It's a brilliant film. And the thing is, it doesn't just replace negative stereotypes with so-called positive ones. Right? Its entire effort is to humanize difference and otherness, rather than to just try and make Arabs a part of the sameness and the familiarity we already have. And I think that's probably the lesson that we should take from this, is not only is pop culture, and film is one of the most powerful mediums we have at our disposal. I do a lot of work in sound and in music. But to me, pop culture films are perhaps the most important form we have for communicating these notions of self and other. If we take from that this notion that pop culture is something we need to pay attention to, our next step is to try and understand how we can use pop culture to confront, combat, and transcend these same representational practices, right? How can we use pop culture to humanize otherness and difference? How do we use pop culture to present textured understandings of people's positionality, the intersectional experience of violence? Right? So every time I teach this in class, someone always raises their hand and says, yeah, but you know what? there are terrorists in the Arab world. You know what? Muslims, there are Muslim terrorists out there. And you know what? Those things that you show in those films, those things, they might have been dramatized, but they really do happen after McDonald. Well, what do you say to that? What do you say to that?
What is your definition of terrorism? Would you consider Timothy McVeigh a terrorist? Would you consider, what's the latest, the fellow from Ohio who was down at Charlottesville, who ran over the little girl, the young woman. Is he a terrorist? Or are acts of Arabs, by definition, terrorism, and everything else is perhaps not? On the other hand, if you drop an atomic bomb on an entire city, is that an act of terrorism? Is that an act of terrorism by a Christian nation?
Yeah.
So we need to define terrorism, and don't let the trumpet define it for us. Don't let him define what is fake news and what is not fake news. We all know that NBC produces fake news. That's why he wants to remove their charter. Whereas Walt Disney obviously does not produce fake news. I mean, this Walt Disney is more his level, I think. What we have to do is not let the trumpets of the world, and even those before the trumpet, define the reality for us.
Right.
Let's go back to this movie for a second. As I recall, he mentioned in the first movie Jamie Farr.
Yeah.
Is that right? Jamie Farr in the movie played a bad Arab, is that right?
A lecherous Arab, yeah.
Jamie Farr is an American Arab
He's Lebanese.
from Toledo. In fact, I think maybe my older parts of my family knew his family back in Toledo. Would he get credit as being an American Arab who, would he be given credit as playing, would he be given credit as an American Arab demonstrating a bad Arab? Would this somehow make him a good Arab, a good American Arab? When I saw that, I mean, I know the name Jamie Farr. He played in the movie about Korea, what is it? MASH, that's right. I don't know if he was identified in this first movie as an Arab, an American Arab, in the advertisements. I don't know that he was identified as an American Arab in MASH, but in any case, when I heard that, I thought, Jamie, how the hell could you do this? How could you betray us like that? Okay, why don't we get a real American to play a bad Arab? Okay, don't betray us like that. Let somebody else do it. Well,
There's
okay.
also the problem of the character in the first place, regardless of who's playing it.
What's that?
There's also the problem of the character in the first place,
Well,
regardless of
I
who's
mean, that's
playing
why I
it.
didn't want Jamie to play it. Let some lecherous person play the damn thing. Let the Trump play it or something like that. Anyway, that was my own thing. But to answer your question, I think we need to be precise in our definitions.
Sure.
Don't let Hollywood and Washington have a symbiotic relation in which they will define the terms. Don't let them define terrorism for us. Don't let them define this or that for us. We've got to continually educate people to be a little bit more precise. What do you mean by terrorism? What are acts of terrorism? Clearly, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the two most egregious terrorist acts of maybe all time. They were clearly terrorist acts to end the war. That was a super terrorist act. We didn't drop leaflets and say, let's make peace. We wanted to end the war with the supreme act of terrorism. We invented this a really marvelous thing, because as a scientific thing, it was a marvelous thing for the most evil action. And that ended the war. That was a supreme act of terrorism.
So there is this nuancing of our terms, nuancing what it means, terrorism. What is terrorism? The discourse of terrorism, nuancing our understanding of that. Another way in which we might come at that response from a student pointing out to the violence that we see in the Arab world is to understand, yes, and it's no different than the violence we have in our own society here. It is no different than the kind of violence that we experience every day. The kind of lecherousness that we see in this film, we need not look farther than our own highest levels of government, right? Or in the highest levels of Hollywood to find those same things. Try all of the kind of negative stereotypes we see here are things that we experience within our own society. So that becomes the way in which I try to engage that question, is saying, if we can see the worst in others, why can't we see the worst in ourselves? Why do we only see the best of ourselves and the worst of others? And the answer to that question is, that's the result of discourse. It's the result of the kind of grievability discourse, where some lives are grievable and other lives are ungrievable because they were never really there to begin with, right? You had your hand up, Dr. Sal.
Recently, there was a study showing that among rifles sold in America, the most sold numbers are the ones that show in movies.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. So definitely violence in
Movies become
well.
aspirational documents
Definitely.
for people wanting.
But another recent evolution in Hollywood is the scandal of Harvey Weinstein. And I think if there is anything good that can come out of it, is the mentality of people in Hollywood to investigate more about it and to protect women, but also to realize that they were unethical as maybe a committee. At least some of them were unethical, the way they treated women. They treated their own people, the aspiring young people who wanted to play in Hollywood. And also maybe to look back at what they have done in the past and realize that they were also unethical in the way they represented the others.
Yeah. In many ways, we can see Hollywood and our government operating along similar priorities and along similar political pathways. And in fact, they make the case here that the DNA between Washington and Hollywood is the same, that many of our mainstream movies were written by former secretaries of the Navy. Perhaps a conflict of interest, you might imagine, right? So understanding that popular culture is not this epiphenomenal entertainment industry that doesn't have effects in society, but rather popular culture is one of the driving forces of not only our perceptions of self and other, but the exact politics that our government pursues. And if anything, that would be the thing I would want to leave you with today, is to be more critical in your understanding of popular culture. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate such a great turnout. I hope to see you next semester at the screening for Junction 48. It will be at the IU Cinema second week of April, so keep on the lookout. And like there, we'll leave it there. So thank you so much.